Hi friends, I welcome you all here at TNV Academy. In this session, we are going to talk about an international standard ISO 13485 2016. Now we shall discuss about the clause 8 of standard, that is measurement, analysis and improvement. Let's start with subclause 8.1 general. According to this subclause 8.1 of ISO 13485, the organization is required to plan and implement the monitoring, measurement, analysis, and improvement processes needed to demonstrate conformity of the product, to ensure conformity of the quality management system, and to maintain the effectiveness of the quality management system. As per clause, monitoring, measurement, analysis, and improvement processes must include determination of appropriate methods, including statistical techniques and the extent of their use. Now, coming to subclause 8.2, monitoring and measurement. Let me start with 8.2.1, feedback. As one of the measurements of the effectiveness of the quality management system, the organization is required to gather and monitor information relating to whether the organization has met customer requirements. As per clause 8.2.1, the methods for obtaining and using this information must be documented. The subclause 8.2.1 states that the organization is required to document procedures for the feedback process. This feedback process must include provisions to gather data from production as well as post-production activities. According to this subclause, the information gathered in the feedback process must serve as potential input into risk management for monitoring and maintaining the product requirements as well as the product realization or improvement processes. Subclause further states that if applicable regulatory requirements require the organization to gain specific experience from post-production activities, the review of this experience must form part of the feedback process. Let's talk about 8.2.2, complaint handling. This subclause 8.2.2 of ISO 13485 states that the organization is required to document procedures for timely complaint handling in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. These procedures must include, at a minimum, requirements and responsibilities for receiving and recording information, evaluating information to determine if the feedback constitutes a complaint, investigating complaints, determining the need to report the information to the appropriate regulatory authorities, handling of complaint related product, and determining the need to initiate corrections or corrective actions. This clause says that if any complaint is not investigated, organization is required to document the justification. An organization is also required to document any correction or corrective action resulting from the complaint handling process. As per this subclause, if an investigation determines activities outside the organization contributed to the complaint, then relevant information is required to be exchanged between the organization and the external party involved. Lastly, as per this subclause 8.2.2, the complaint handling records are required to be maintained by the organization to meet the requirements of the standard ISO 13485 2016. Let me discuss now the subclause 8.2.3, reporting to regulatory authorities. This subclause 8.2.3 specifies that the organization is required to document procedures for providing notification to the appropriate regulatory authorities. If applicable regulatory requirements require notification of complaints that meet specified reporting criteria of adverse events or issuance of advisory notices. Further, according to this clause, records of reporting to regulatory authorities are required to be maintained by the organization. Now, let me come to the subclause 8.2.4 of ISO 13485 2016, that is internal audit. According to this subclause, the organization is required to conduct internal audits at planned intervals to determine whether the quality management system conforms to planned and documented arrangements, requirements of this international standard, quality management system requirements established by the organization, and applicable regulatory requirements. Subclause 8.2.4 also specifies that the organization is required to conduct internal audits at planned intervals to determine whether the quality management system is effectively implemented and maintained. This subclause states that the organization must document a procedure to describe the responsibilities and requirements for planning and conducting audits and recording and reporting audit results. According to this subclause, an audit program is required to be planned by an organization, taking into consideration the status and importance of the processes and area to be audited, as well as the results of previous audits. Subclause 8.2.4 says that the audit criteria, scope, interval, and methods must be defined and recorded by the organization. The organization is required to ensure that the selection of auditors and conduct of audits must ensure objectivity and impartiality of the audit process. This clause states that the auditors must not audit their own work during the internal audit. Further, this subclause states that the organization is required to maintain the records of the audits and their results, including identification of the processes and areas audited, and also the conclusions of the audits. The subclause 8.2.4 states that the management is responsible for the area being audited, must ensure that any necessary corrections and corrective actions are taken without undue delay to eliminate detected nonconformities and their causes. The organization is required to include the verification of the actions taken and the reporting of verification results of follow-up activities. At the end, the clause guides to study ISO 19011 for further information about it. Coming to the subclause 8.2.5, monitoring and measurement of processes. This subclause 8.2.5 of ISO 13485 states that the organization is required to apply suitable methods for monitoring and measurement of the quality management system processes as appropriate. These methods must demonstrate the ability of the processes to achieve planned results. As per clause, organization is required to take appropriate correction and corrective actions when planned results are not achieved. Let us now discuss the subclause 8.2.6, monitoring and measurement of product. The subclause 8.2.6 specifies that the organization is required to monitor and measure the characteristics of the product to verify that product requirements have been met. This must be carried out at applicable stages of the product realization process in accordance with the planned and documented arrangements and documented procedures. This subclause says that evidence of conformity to the acceptance criteria must be maintained by the organization. The organization must record the identity of the person authorizing release of the product. According to this clause 8.2.6, appropriate records must identify the test equipment used to perform measurement activities. Further, as per this standard, the product release and service delivery must not proceed until the planned and documented arrangements have been satisfactorily completed. The subclause 8.2.6 states that for implantable medical devices, the organization is required to record the identity of personnel performing any inspection or testing. Let us talk about subclause 8.3, control of non-conforming product. Subclause 8.3.1 general states that the organization is required to ensure that product which does not conform to product requirements is identified and controlled to prevent its unintended use or delivery. This clause says that the organization must document a procedure to define the controls and related responsibilities and authorities for the identification, documentation, segregation, evaluation, and disposition of non-conforming product. As per this subclause 8.3.1, the evaluation of non-conformity must include a determination of the need for an investigation and notification of any external party responsible for the non-conformity. Further, this subclause states that organization is required to maintain the records of the nature of the nonconformities and any subsequent action taken, including the evaluation. Organization must also maintain any investigation and the rationale for decisions to meet the requirements of the standard. Coming to subclause 8.3.2, actions in response to non-conforming product detected before delivery. This subclause 8.3.2 of ISO 13485 2016 states that the organization is required to deal with non-conforming product by one or more of the ways, like taking action to eliminate the detected non-conformity, taking action to prelude its original intended use or application, and authorizing its use, release, or acceptance under concession. According to this subclause 8.3.2, the organization must ensure that non-conforming product is accepted by concession only if the justification is provided, approval is obtained, and applicable regulatory requirements are met. The subclause specifies that organization is required to maintain the records of the acceptance by concession and the identity of the person authorizing the concession to meet the requirements of the standard. Let's talk now about the subclause 8.3.3, actions in response to non-conforming product detected after delivery. This subclause states that when non-conforming product is detected after delivery or use has started, the organization is required to take action appropriate to the effects or potential effects of the non-conformity. This subclause also says that the organization is required to maintain the records of actions. The subclause 8.3.3 states that the organization must document procedures for issuing advisory notices in accordance with applicable regulatory requirements. These procedures must be capable of being put into effect at any time. According to this subclause, organization is required to maintain records of actions relating to the issuance of advisory notices. Coming to subclause 8.3.4, rework. This subclause 8.3.4 states that the organization must perform rework in accordance with documented procedures that take into account the potential adverse effects of the rework on the product. These procedures must undergo the same review and approval as the original procedure. Clause 8.3.4 states that after the completion of the rework, product must be verified to ensure that it meets applicable acceptance criteria and regulatory requirements. Lastly, the subclause 8.3.4 of ISO 13485 specifies that organization is required to maintain the records of rework to meet the requirements of this standard. Let us talk about clause 8.4, analysis of data. This clause 8.4 of ISO 13485 2016 says that the organization is required to document procedures to determine, collect, and analyze appropriate data to demonstrate the suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the quality management system. The procedures must include determination of appropriate methods, including statistical techniques and the extent of their use. Further, the clause 8.4 says that the analysis of data must include data generated as a result of monitoring and measurement and from other relevant sources. The data must include, at a minimum, input from feedback, conformity to product requirements, characteristics and trends of processes and products, including opportunities for improvement, suppliers, audits, and service reports as appropriate. This clause further states that if the analysis of the data shows that the quality management system is not suitable, adequate, or effective, the organization must use this analysis as input for improvement as required in clause 8.5 of the standard. Lastly, the clause 8.4 specifies that the organization is required to records of the results of analysis to meet the requirements of the standard. We shall now talk about clause 8.5, improvement. Let me discuss the subclause 8.5.1, general. Subclause 8.5.1 of ISO 13485 specifies that the organization is required to identify and implement any changes necessary to ensure and maintain the continued suitability, adequacy, and effectiveness of the quality management system. The organization is also required to identify and implement any changes necessary to ensure and maintain medical device safety and performance through the use of the quality policy, quality objectives, audit results, post-market surveillance, analysis of data, corrective actions, preventive actions, and management review. Coming now to the subclause 8.5.2, corrective action. According to this subclause 8.5.2, the organization must take action to eliminate the cause of nonconformities in order to prevent recurrence. The organization is required to take any necessary corrective actions without undue delay. As per this clause 8.5.2, corrective actions must be proportionate to the effects of the nonconformities encountered. This clause says that the organization must document a procedure to define requirements for reviewing nonconformities, including complaints, determining the causes of nonconformities, evaluating the need for action to ensure that nonconformities do not recur, planning and documenting action needed, and implementing such action, including, as appropriate, updating documentation. Verifying that the corrective action does not adversely affect the ability to meet applicable regulatory requirements or the safety and performance of the medical device, and reviewing the effectiveness of corrective action taken. Further, subclause 8.5.2 of ISO 13485 states that the organization is required to maintain the records of the results of any investigation and of action taken to meet the requirements of the standard. Let us discuss the subclause 8.5.3, preventive action. According to this subclause 8.5.3, the organization is required to determine action to eliminate the causes of potential nonconformities in order to prevent their occurrence. Subclause says that the preventive actions must be proportionate to the effects of the potential problems. Further, the subclause 8.5.3 states that the organization must document a procedure to describe requirements for determining potential nonconformities and their causes, evaluating the need for action to prevent occurrence of nonconformities, planning and documenting action needed, and implementing such action, including, as appropriate, updating documentation. Verifying that the action does not adversely affect the ability to meet applicable regulatory requirements or the safety and performance of the medical device, and reviewing the effectiveness of the preventive action taken as appropriate. This clause specifies that the organization must maintain the records of the results of any investigations and of action taken to meet the requirements of the standard. Friends, we have finished all the clauses of ISO 13485 2016 Medical Devices Quality Management System. The standard ISO 13485 2016 also provides a correspondence between ISO 13485 2016 and ISO 9001 2015 under Annex B and a bibliography for more detailed information about various fundamentals, techniques, and requirements, etc. You can see here on the screen the correspondence between ISO 13485 2016 and ISO 9001 2015 and bibliography at the end of the session, and could explore more about the standards. So friends, now we have reached at the end of this session. I hope that you have an idea about ISO 13485 2016 Medical Devices Quality Management System. For more information about our institute and other training programs, you can contact us through email or phone. I sincerely thank you for all your interest and attention. Thanks and best wishes.